to get right into the most exciting time of the year, which is our annual discussion of operating budget and the 2025 to 2029 capital improvement program. With me, as always, is our budget director, Jonathan Hobbs. By way of agenda today, we'll start as we always do, talking about our strategic framework and guiding principles. It's really the lenses that we use to make decisions. We want to be transparent both on what we're doing, but how we make the decisions about what we choose to do. We're making a lot of progress on City Council strategic priorities, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we'll talk to you a little bit about that. The process, we want to be really clear about how we're aligning the resources we have available to us in terms of making decisions to execute the strategy. Council has, as part of our strategic plan, expressed desired outcomes in terms of safety and security, environmental responsibility, cultural diversity, connectivity, and economic prosperity. So we'll talk to you a little bit about progress on those items. Jonathan will get into some of the specifics in terms of the numbers on the budget process. We'll conclude with the process from where we are today to final budget adoption, and then any wrap up with any closing thoughts. So I know you've seen this a lot. You helped develop this vision, revalidated this vision a few years ago. I won't read the entire thing, but we sort of boil it down to making Chesapeake an exceptional place to live, learn, work, farm, and play. That's what all of our teammates are about every single day. In terms of decision making, these are the lenses that we use to make decisions. So helping to make Chesapeake an exceptional place to live, learn, work, farm, and play, that's right based on our vision. Providing outstanding service to City Council, our community, our customers, and our teammates here within the city, that's based on our core values. And then being fiscally responsible and sustainable, that's based on Council's budget guiding principles. And those principles have served us very well. They're very unique. Not a lot of cities actually have those budget guardrails, and so we really take those into account as we're developing the budget. I mentioned these desired outcomes. I won't go through them again, but everything within the budget is either addressing a federal or state mandate, a council priority, or directly addressing one of these desired outcome areas. This is our strategic framework. It's how it all works together. So council, elected by the community, creates the vision for what the city wants to be now and in the future. I mentioned the strategic anchors and the outcomes. And then if you think about on any given Tuesday, you're adopting lots of different plans or policies to put that vision and the strategy into action. And then it's our job as staff to make recommendations to you, and then to ultimately go and execute and deliver services and programs on behalf of City Council directly to the community. So what are Council's budget guiding principles? I've mentioned this a few times. Number one, no increase in the real estate tax rate. As Council will recall, the tax rate in Chesapeake the real estate rate was $1.05, I think for 16 or 17 years straight. 2 years ago, Council reduced that rate to $1.01. That 4-cent reduction was done through an actively applied rebate on people's bills, and then last year it was made a permanent tax cut. So this budget maintains the current rate of $1.01 per $100 of assessed valuation. Budget guiding principle number 2, do not add new fees. So this budget contains no new fees. Number 3, we do not supplant losses in state or federal funds with local funds. So you think about a lot of places, they'll apply for grant funds, they'll create a new program or new service. The grant funds invariably go away, but that service has a life of its own, and it will just continue. Chesapeake makes a very purposeful choice. If grant funds go away or other non-city funds go away, we will make a purposeful choice. We'll bring it to City Council to figure out if you want to continue that program and service. We won't just automatically backfill lost federal or state funds for programs or services. And then guiding principle 4, we only deviate from those first 3 if addressing Council's strategic priorities. So if there was something that was so important that I felt like I needed to advertise a tax increase, even though that was deviating from Council's budget guidance, or advertise a new fee. So this budget does not deviate at all from Council's budget guiding principles. We always present this to you just to sort of get a lay of the land in terms of what's happening in our peer jurisdictions. You can see from the chart here, this is what we call the tax and fee burden. You can see how our major taxes and fees stack up to the other jurisdictions. The largest outlier, of course, is in the city of Chesapeake. We don't have a solid waste fee. The other jurisdictions have full cost recovery, meaning they operate solid waste like an enterprise, like we do with utilities. So that's a good comparison there. And then on the next slide, this is something we show you every year in terms of the regional comparison. Chesapeake remains, under this proposed budget, we would remain the lowest tax and fee burden of any jurisdiction within the region. That's several years running now. I mentioned making progress on City Council's strategic priorities. So I appreciate the team presenting this chart. I hope you all know that as you're saying things throughout the year, we're listening, we're capturing these items. These are items that you've asked us during the course of the year to address in the budget. And I'll run through these really, really quickly. Cedar Lake's traffic signal, increasing support to our agricultural preservation programs, taking a look at possibly renaming Portsmouth Boulevard as part of the Chesapeake Square redevelopment that's going on, providing general fund support to our public defender's office, providing general fund support to the Great Bridge Battlefield Museum, investigating whether we could create a behavioral health docket in General District Court, addressing the realigning George Washington Highway and Moses Grandy Road, that intersection, addressing mental health counseling services in our public safety teams, reducing the concealed carry permit fees, revising the fire inspection fees schedule, providing free community center memberships to city employees, and then reducing or eliminating the farm equipment taxes. So these are things that we've captured from a variety of work sessions or agenda items that we've had throughout the year that are germane to the budget. The ones that are highlighted or that remain bolded are the ones that are in my proposed budget. So we've addressed and fully funded the Cedar Lakes traffic signal. We've increased support to our agricultural preservation programs. We are providing funding for the mental health counseling services for our public safety teams and actually for our general workforce as well. We are proposing a reduction in the concealed carry permit fees, a revision to the fire inspection fees, and making the community center memberships free for city employees. The one that's highlighted in yellow is one that we recommend making progress on, but it's not quite what the organization has requested. And so I'll get into that in a little bit. So you saw this at a work session about a month ago. These are the City Council priority areas that we continue to track. These are what's fully programmed or funded in the current budget. Public Safety Training Academy obviously is the lion's share of those funds. So as we mentioned to you, the previously approved budget only had funds for phase one. It was actually originally conceived as a 5-phase project. The length of time it would take to achieve all 5 phases would put the project way beyond the limits of our financial capacity. And in addition, it would be decades before full completion where the teams could take full service of the training opportunities. So we've accelerated that project into 1 phase. That requires an addition of $104.5 million, and it does require some sacrifice in the programs and facilities that we will provide, but overall it'll be a substantial reduction in what the original program was in terms of the 5-phase program, and get the teams access to the services as quickly as possible. You can see some other line items on there. Several things fully funded. We have maintained our commitment to the public safety pay plan, general workforce competitiveness, our enhanced stormwater maintenance program, continue the work on small area plans in the community, and as we mentioned, the community pool remains fully funded, the Cuffey Center pool. Next slide, this is what's partially programmed or funded in my proposed budget. So road maintenance, we had previously allocated $1.25 million per year. We've added $200,000 per year for that program. It's nowhere near what our recurring need is. So if you recall, when we had this conversation a few years ago, there was 0 per year. So we continue to make progress every year, but the projects get more expensive. So we're making progress, but to some extent we're marking time, and these roads are continuing to get older. There's new roads added to the system all the time, so this is something that we need to continue to work on year over year. City facilities, space needs, and security. We've done a lot to improve the security of our facilities and take care of our city facilities. The taxpayers have invested billions of dollars in assets, and it's up to us to make sure that we're taking care of those assets, so we continue to make progress there. The adult detention facility, we have actually an agenda item tonight on some renovations that we need to accommodate bringing back the inmate population from the regional jail. So you'll see that on your agenda tonight, and then added in the budget moving forward. Continuing to advance site readiness. We have some of the most prime economic development sites in the state to make sure that we're well positioned to attract companies. We continue to do work on site preparation, and then strategic land acquisition. Council over time has made several strategic acquisitions. I can think of some to accelerate the Deep Creek Bridge project, where the Corps of Engineers was unable to quickly secure properties. The City of Chesapeake was able to step in and quickly do those acquisitions. We have that for economic development as well from time to time. And then what I would put in the minimally funded or unfunded category. So Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum, they had a capital request of $4.6 million. This is to do an auditorium where they could program activities and events, and then a meeting room where they could program activities and events. It's part of their plan to try to generate additional visitors, drive traffic to the museum, generate additional revenue. It is a city-owned facility, so investments there would be investments in city facilities, but we do not have not programmed any funding in the budget for that. Operating funding request from Great Bridge Battlefield Waterways Museum. We provide about $35,000 worth of direct contribution right now. We provide indirect contributions in terms of maintenance and facility services through the Parks and Recreation Department. They've made a request. I actually think the request is in excess of $300,000 a year. We've looked at something that's a little bit less than that at $100,000 to $150,000 per year. So I mentioned this earlier in the slides. We are taking a look at the numbers at the museum, and as we bring Cornland School and the Dismal Swamp Village online, to try to find out what kind of tourism activity they're generated, whether or not it would be appropriate use of tourism funds, perhaps not general fund dollars, but the tourism dollars are there intended to be able to use towards facilities and services that drive tourism. So that's a work in progress, but I just wanted to keep it on Council's list since you did identify it as an unfunded priority. And then last month, we briefed you on the Performing Arts and Convocation Center. We're calling it the Multi-Purpose Event Center. That request was well in excess of $300 million, and we have no funds programmed in the budget for that facility. So the budget process itself, a quick reminder, when we do the budget every year, let me switch. Heath gave me a backup. Neither is working. Can we manually advance? So as you recall, the budget process is what we call start, stop, continue. So we don't start with last year's budget as the base and build from that. We ask agencies to reduce their budget and find out what they would eliminate for their budget that doesn't meet council's priorities. It's no longer a mandate. It was a grant program and the grant funds aren't there. It was a program that was well-intentioned originally, but the constituency isn't there anymore. It's not meeting performance objectives. So for a variety of reasons, we ask agencies to tell us what they would recommend that we stop doing. And before we start any new initiative, we evaluate all the stuff we're doing today to find out if there's anything in the future we should be doing that's more important or would be more effective than things that we're doing today. So, and then the vast majority of things that we do are based on federal, state, or council mandates, and so that we put in the continue column. So what did we stop doing? This is obviously it's not an exhaustive list, but every year we comb through programs and services to find positions that either are vacant and are no longer the most important use of resources, or we might transfer vacant positions to areas which are performing or have additional needs. So you can see we've either reduced or reallocated or eliminated positions in several departments, including parks, human services, adult services, libraries. I mentioned earlier we've removed inmates from the Hampton Roads Regional Jail. So we are stopping that. You'll see later in the presentation that does come. We'll be adding new deputies, making some capital improvements at the facilities, and investing in some behavioral health at the jail. But in totality, all of that is still a substantial upfront savings over the regional jail and a very substantial ongoing savings over time by bringing the inmate population back to the city jail. Additional things that we stopped doing, I believe it was 2 months ago, we talked to council about the rapid rise of inflation. It's abated a little bit, but not enough for comfort. So it's still significantly above where it has been historically, but year over year it is starting to reduce a little bit. But we have programs and projects that were fully funded that are no longer fully funded. And so if these projects are to move forward in the future, we'll need to identify additional funding. And those projects include, this isn't exhaustive, but some of the major projects are George Washington Highway widening, the Mount Pleasant Road at Great Bridge bypass interchange, the Southgate Bridge replacement. In addition, we've significantly modified the scope of some projects. I mentioned the Public Safety Training Academy. That's probably the largest one where we've reduced the scope. We have an emergency vehicle storage facility. We've significantly reduced the scope. Police Academy gym replacement project, we've reduced the scope. So a lot of existing projects that are no longer fully funded, largely due to inflation. So that's what we stopped doing. What did we start doing? We've added some community service aides in the police department. We've done that by converting vacant school crossing guard positions, so that the overall net increase actually to the city complement's only 0.75 FTEs. Funding a public safety equipment replacement program. Providing off-site redundancy for the city's data center. As you can imagine, our data center's needs continue to grow, and we want to make sure we don't have vulnerabilities there with the amount of data that we need to store. And then adding a facade grant improvement program in the Indian River area, similar to what we have in the Great Bridge area, and it's consistent with the small area plan and the design guidelines that council approved some months back. And then the majority of the budget things we continue to do. These are just focusing on council priorities, but we did, as I mentioned earlier, maintain the pay competitiveness, fully funded the public safety step plan, added capacity for public safety structural adjustments and market adjustments if warranted, added a general wage increase for the general workforce consistent with the region to maintain our position in the top 3. We have maintained most of the capital projects that were impacted by inflation. You're going to see a slide earlier, though. The way we're doing this is something I would not recommend all the time. It's really only possible because we have $41 million of one-time funds from the charter change that Council and the General Assembly approved a few years ago. But we are very, very heavily reliant, perhaps over-reliant on one-time funds to balance the capital improvement budget this year. The majority of our bond funding, we're removing bond funding from a lot of individual projects, putting most of the bond funding on the Public Safety Training Academy, which means all the rest of the projects we would have bond funded are going to be cash to capital, and that's why it's such a high reliance on the one-time high priority account. We are rededicating a half cent to the real estate tax to the city lockbox. If you remember, during council's discussion a few years ago, what we call option 2, which is where we had to find ways to pay for the public safety pay plan. We did eliminate a portion of the dedication to the city's lockbox. We are recommending a half cent rededication to that lockbox to help us fund the capital needs now and in the future. And then monitoring fees to make sure that we have the equity and maintain regional competitiveness. As we discussed, we are reducing the concealed carry permit fee to actual cost recovery, and then adjusting the fire safety inspection fee to a tiered rate based on the size of the facilities. So I wanted to highlight a couple slides just to outline some of the things I just talked about. I won't go through these in depth, but certainly this will be available for council and any of our community to ask questions about. Councilmember Whitaker had asked some time ago about adjusting the fire and life safety inspections fees to be consistent more consistent with the size of the facility rather than a flat rate fee structure that is what we had. So you can see there our current rate is 50 regardless of the size of the facility. We're proposing a tiered rate that based on the size of facilities. This is well in line with most of our peer jurisdictions, but you can take a look at there what that would look like. And then, as I mentioned, reducing the concealed carry permit fee from $50 to $25. On the fire and life safety inspection fees, again, before we propose any changes to fee structure, we look at what other jurisdictions are doing. So here you can see what our proposed fee would look like relative to other jurisdictions within the region. Specifically want to call out additions to the position complements in our constitutional offices. So as part of, again, going back to what we termed as option 2 a few years ago to pay for the public safety pay plan and to maintain that plan over time, council directed us to reduce the subsidies to constitutional officers. So we have been pretty successful at that over the past few years. This is the first time since then that we're proposing additions to the complement in the constitutional offices. And so I feel like for transparency, we owe an explanation to council and the community of why we are recommending additional positions, city-funded to constitutional offices. So if you see the top 3 are positions in the city treasurer's office. The city treasurer is performing much better than it was last year. We actually will be bringing a work session in the not too distant future about some significant improvements that they've made in services to the community. But an area that we really could improve on is collections, and then some internal service delivery positions. So the reason we are recommending these positions is the collection agent itself. We expect that those 2 agents will actually generate more revenue than the cost of the positions. And this is revenue that's due to the city based on our adopted tax and fee schedules. And then the part-time positions are contracted labor positions, and the treasurer is confident that bringing those positions in-house will actually be a reduction in the overall budget by reducing contractual labor. Likewise, for the Commissioner of the Revenue, we believe that there is revenue that's been assessed by the city, especially in the business tax side of the house, that we are not currently realizing, and so we believe this position will be at least full cost recovery. In the Commonwealth's attorney, We've had some positions funded through state grants for part-time investigator. There's some additional state revenue available to us, and so we've moved some things around and identified 0.7 FTE that would be needed to fund that part-time investigator position with state funds. And then the sheriff is the vast majority of these positions. These are all directly related to bringing the inmates back from the regional jail and having sustainable jail operations now and in the future. So again, just in the interest of transparency, I wanted to make sure I called those positions out. And then what didn't get funded. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I just wanted to mention some of the bigger items. Public safety training facility, there are several of the features and buildings that we had anticipated in the original project. One of them is the pool. They are not included in the proposed project. We had over $139 million in unfunded capital improvement program requests. We've just listed a few there. So Parker Road widening, that's a project we get asked about a lot. There's many more renovations in the jail that I have not proposed. We've really focused on the ones that are necessary to bring the inmates back to the city jail. But there's other renovations that will be necessary in the future that are unfunded. The sheriff has requested body-worn cameras for the deputies. That's a best practice that he would like us to consider, but we do not have the funding for that. We had $7.9 million in unfunded operating budget requests from the agencies or community partners. So a request to expand our police recruitment budget, a request to expand business development representative services through economic development, our overall vehicle replacement. The cost of maintaining the city fleet has become astronomical, also driven by inflation, so we have significant unfunded needs there. But within our resource constraints, we try to continue to do the best we can to achieve council's desired outcomes. That's largely by investing in our employees. So I mentioned this earlier, but we are adding $9.5 million to maintain the public safety pay plan, to maintain the general workforce pay plan. Added $3.7 million in employee benefits. These are largely driven by VRS rate increases and health insurance increases. We continue our commitment to economic prosperity by investing in our communities. We continue to invest in South Norfolk in a variety of ways. Obviously, we'll be building the municipal project. We expect that to both enhance city services, but also spur economic investment in the community. Likewise, we've added funds for the South Norfolk Residential Rehabilitation Program to continue to spur reinvestment in South Norfolk. We've added funds for a Western Branch area plan to continue to work with private sector developers in that area to plan for the ultimate redevelopment. And then small business retention. We've had a lot of success through and post-pandemic in providing more small business assistance services. We'd like to continue to enhance those services. They've been very successful for us. There's more services that we could be providing, so we've added a position to provide additional small business support services. In terms of connectivity, we've added a position in information technology to maintain the radio team. We've actually found some, I wouldn't call them, I'll say substandard in terms of meeting best practices in our coverage here. So we want to make sure that both from a connectivity and a safety and security perspective, we're investing here. Part of connectivity includes vehicle connectivity, so we continue to make progress on easing congestion in our major intersections and roadway corridors, and then directly addressing community concerns. One of the ones that we heard frequently through the last year was the need for a traffic signal at Cedar Road and Cedar Lakes Drive. So we fully funded that project in my proposed budget. Advancing cultural diversity. One of the things council asked was to find ways for small businesses in Chesapeake to have an easier time doing business with the city of Chesapeake. So we're investing in and implementing e-bidding software to make it much easier for small businesses, including minority-owned businesses, to be able to compete for city jobs. Aiding vulnerable residents with housing. We've provided additional staffing, which is funded by the state, but to expand permanent supportive housing through CIBH. And then we've added the new positions to be able to operate the Historic Village and Cornland School project once that opens later this year. From an environmental responsibility, we continue to invest in open space. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. We continue to work with FEMA to convert severe repetitive loss properties into parkland, and then making sure that we're properly staffed up to be able to acquire either easements or rights of way, or actually fee simple property when we identify open space or agricultural preservation properties that we want to invest in. So speaking of ag and open space and farming, this is something that we've talked about a lot. We're advancing zoning text amendments to be able to help preserve open space. We've been pretty successful in using our existing resource with open space acquisitions, but we certainly can do more. You had a presentation from your Ag Advisory Committee last year about items that we could be doing, and one of the things was to continue to invest in open space. So we have included some additional funding for open space and ag preservation. In addition, we wanted to make sure that we're capturing the full value of these programs. So in terms of the acquisition costs, what the city invests to be able to execute those agreements. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the value of the city-owned land that's made available to farmers through low-cost leases. This is really, really unique. There's not a lot of jurisdictions that I'm aware of. You all know I'm from central Pennsylvania, a lot of farming communities there, a lot of farming that still happens in some parts of Virginia. Chesapeake is, I've mentioned this before, we are losing farmland at what I have termed an alarming rate, but the city is part of the solution. We have almost over 1,000 acres that we have made available for farm leases. We have almost 1,000 acres that are being currently leased for farming. So that if you see the average value of the market value of an acre of farmland is about $8,500, so that's $8.5 million investment, direct investment of the city in the farm economy through making city land available for farming. And then you can see the average land use value, which in land use valuation would be about $3.2 million of value that we're making available. So pretty significant investments that the city is making, and we would like to continue acquiring open space and then making that land available to the farm community as council sees fit. In terms of safety and security, I mentioned Accelerating Public Safety Training Academy. I also mentioned this is really, really important. Councilmember Newens had brought this up a couple times during the past year, but making sure that we have dedicated mental health counseling services available to our first responders. I think we have a pretty good program. We've worked very heavily with public safety and human resources, and we believe we'll have the capacity to make this available to the entire workforce, but we want to make sure we have specific certification and training in trauma-informed care specific for public safety. The traumas that they experience are very different from what the general workforce experiences. Life cycle replacement of life-saving tools and equipment. We have an excellent AED program with AEDs deployed in, those are defibrillators deployed in public facilities and parks. Many of them are nearing the end of life, and so we want to make sure that we're replacing those on an appropriate life cycle. and then overtime funding to ensure minimum staffing levels. So we have very low vacancy rates in fire. We've continued to add in the fire department, fire and rescue personnel. We still have a very significant use of overtime. We're trying to drive that number down over time, but I just want to be aware that this budget does anticipate significant overtime again in the coming year. And so I will turn it over to Jonathan to go through some of the specifics on the numbers, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from council.
All right, thanks, Chris. Good evening. It's good to be here again this year, and I'm going to walk you through some of the numbers associated with the budget. We're going to start on the expenditure side, looking at the city's operating budget. In total, looking at the city and schools net operating budget for FY25, it totals just over $1.6 billion. As you can see, the split between the city and schools is approximately 50-50. It's been that way for the last several years. 52% on the city side, 48% on the school side. The city budget is growing by about 5.5%. The school budget is growing at about 2.1%. However, there's a significant factor driving down the growth in the school budget, and that's in their grants fund. They have about a $19 million loss in their grant fund, and that's part of what's pulling that number down. I'm going to show you a slide here in just a few moments looking at their operating fund similar to the city's general fund, and what you'll see is that that fund is actually growing very comparable to the city budget. So just wanted to make sure that we pointed that out. So what's driving the growth on the city side of the budget? Again, Chris mentioned this earlier. We are expending about $13 million of additional funding for our workforce pay competitiveness. This is in terms of salary increases to maintain the top three, as well as some increasing benefit costs from VRS, Line of Duty Act, group life insurance. As Chris mentioned, inflation, the growth in inflation, the rate of growth is down, but inflation overall is still going up. And that certainly impacts our ability to purchase goods and services as a city, or to bid projects on the capital side. And I'm going to show you some specific slides and some specific items and projects that we've seen those increasing costs in just a moment, but it's still impacting us. And then we also have added, I would say, more than normal in terms of new staff, certainly more this year than we have any other year since I've been here. But a lot of that is associated with new funding we're receiving from the state. In CIBH alone, we are adding 31 new positions, I believe, and those are exclusively state funding. However, that does drive the bottom line in terms of the overall budget. So while it's not local dollars, it is state funding, and it is increasing the overall budget. And we also have some costs that are driven by revenue growth. First being the transfer to the schools through the revenue sharing agreement, and also the 12% policy reserve. As council knows, you adopted a new fund balance policy last year as we were going into as part of the budget process. And that policy states that 12% of all new revenue must be set aside. So the first 12% of all new revenue is the first thing we must expend, and we send that to fund balance as part of your policy reserve. So I showed you this graphic last year. Obviously wanted to show you it again this year so you can see, again, like I mentioned a moment ago, inflation is still increasing. From January of 23 to January of 24, it's up 3.9%. However, when we looked at this same graphic last year, it was 6.6% at its peak. So again, the rate of growth is down, but inflation overall is still up. And what does that mean for us in terms of specifics? Let me first orient you to this slide. Unfortunately, I was able to show you a slide just like this last year, and it had different items on it. I'm hoping that next year we won't have a slide similar to this because costs will moderate. But again, for the second consecutive year, we have a host of items that are increasing in cost. On the left-hand side, you see the department. Then you see the item, the previous cost, the cost we anticipate we'll be paying in FY25, and then the rate of increase. So what I would note on this slide, and we didn't go specifically looking for high rates of increase, but we found some. The lowest percent increase here is 8.5%, but of note is that there are a number of items on this list that are increasing by over 20%. So without additional resources, that means we're seeing a reduction in buying power. Looking at the capital side, and again, we have a similar story here, and Chris mentioned some of these projects earlier in his portion of the presentation, but I want to highlight something in particular. I've put a box around these three projects. All three of these projects in last year's CIP were considered fully funded, and we were going to be able to execute the project within the scope as written. Due to cost increases, we no longer have adequate funding to complete these projects. So these projects all now have a future funding requirement. So what does that mean? That basically means that we can either delay these projects until we can determine some additional funding, we can pursue grants, or we could cancel or abandon these projects. Unfortunately, with two of these, there is state funding that we've received for these projects associated with them. So if we were to abandon these projects and decide we weren't going to do them, obviously we would have to return that funding to the state or ask them if we could reallocate it. So, but again, these are some significant cost increases. There's a project there in the stormwater section increasing by over 84%. Looking at our contribution to schools since 2021, as you can see, our contribution to the schools through the revenue sharing formula has steadily increased over time. And from FY24 to FY25, we are estimating an increase of 5.6%. In total, we will contribute $281.8 million to the schools through the revenue sharing formula. And then on top of that, obviously, the funding that we provide to them through the lot box. So the story on the school side is very similar to the city side. What's causing their budget to grow and to increase? And I just want to make sure I'm very specific. This is all based on the superintendent's proposed budget. The timing of their adoption by their board does not allow us to include that in this presentation. So this is based on the superintendent's proposed budget. He is proposing a 3% salary increase. He's also proposing to raise the minimum salary for teachers up to over $55,000 a year. In terms of positions, they have a number of positions that were funded by federal grants. I mentioned they were going to have a $19 million loss of federal grants. So what they've done is they've taken those positions out of those grant funds and they've moved them to their operating fund so that they could continue those positions and continue to provide those programs and services that were funded previously by federal grants. In total, their operating fund is increasing by about 5.6%. In their other funds, the school insurance fund is increasing by $3 million. The nutrition fund is increasing by $2 million. And as I mentioned, the grants fund is declining. So looking at their operating budget by fund, in total, the school's proposed budget based on the superintendent's proposal is just over $767 million, and that is the net budget. Looking back on the city side and looking at operating expenditures by category, it should come as no surprise to anyone that the largest proportion of expenses on the city side is for personnel. That's that blue slice of the pie. It makes up approximately 50% of all expenditures in the city. And then the second largest portion there is general expenses. These are your normal operating expenditures, basically the supplies that our personnel need to conduct the business and provide programs and services. And then the smallest proportion goes to capital outlay at just over $11 million. We always think that this is an interesting graphic to show to you. This is looking exclusively at the general fund and how a dollar in the general fund is expended. Now keep in mind, this is non-discretionary or excuse me, this is discretionary spending only. So the 12% policy reserve is taken out of these calculations. And the interesting piece here is that if you take the contribution to the schools as well as our allocation to our public safety departments, that makes up 70% of the total general fund. And what that means is that we are operating those other departments, programs, and services in the general fund with the remaining 30% of the general fund dollars. So the vast majority of the general fund is composed of our contribution to schools and our public safety agencies. Now we're going to look over on the revenue side. And again, we're going to stick with the operating budget here. And again, we're looking at the total revenue by source here for city and schools. As you can see, okay, I've got this one boxed. Brought up a box there on state revenue. That is the largest individual source of revenue in the total operating budget, and that's followed at 31.1% by general property tax. That's our real estate tax, personal property taxes. What's interesting here is that that state revenue figure of over $500 million, 72% of that amount actually goes to the schools. It's only 28% that comes to the city. So I'm going to show you a table a little bit later that looks at just the general fund, and you'll see kind of a flip in terms of the percentage of general property tax, the total revenue in that fund that is made up of general property taxes versus state revenue. So it's a little bit of a different picture depending on how you're looking at the budget. Wanted to look at real estate tax and look at assessments and the tax rate and just do a little brief deep dive into this. This slide shows the historical growth in real estate assessments since back in fiscal year 2010. As you can see, during the Great Recession, we were actually, and coming out of the Great Recession, assessments were actually declining. And then again, coming out of the recession, we had really stable growth in terms of our real estate assessments, moving along from roughly 1 to 4%, what I would call stable growth in those assessments. And then in FY23, we had that significant increase of 14.4%. For FY25, we're coming back closer down to that normal range at 4.5% in terms of assessment growth. Now, what I would remind the viewing public is that real estate tax revenue is really driven by two things. It's not just assessments, it is also the tax rate. You have to marry those two variables in terms of making a tax bill. So as this graphic shows, the real estate tax rate was very stable, as Chris mentioned earlier. Even in years where we were experiencing declining assessments, the rate maintained at $1.05. And then back in 23, when those assessments jumped significantly by 14%, council decided to reduce the real estate tax rate down to $1.01, and then the following year made that temporary or active rebate reduction permanent, and this budget obviously maintains that rate. So when you do put those two variables together and we look at budgeted real estate tax revenue, what you see on this slide is not that significant jump in 2023, and that's because of that tax rate reduction. What you see is a more normalized pattern of growth in this particular revenue stream. And from FY24 to FY25, we are estimating about a 4.3% increase in this revenue source. Over the years, City Council has dedicated real estate tax revenue to a number of different programs. Chris mentioned earlier the OSAP program. There's a $271,000 dedication to that. We have 2 TIFs that real estate tax is dedicated to. And for this year, as Chris mentioned, there is a new dedication. It is not additive to the rate. It is within the existing dollar general government rate, or $1 rate if you add on the dedication for mosquito control. And that's that new half-cent dedication of the real estate tax rate to the city lot box. What this is allowing us to do is to fund that debt service associated with that significant increase in resources that we are making for the Public Safety Training Academy. So that will help us to fund that debt service over the coming years. And you can see that there highlighted by that box. Personal property tax revenue is a very similar story to real estate. FY23 was a significant year of assessment growth. In fact, in that year, assessments grew so tremendously, City Council decided at that time to reduce assessments from the 100% market value down to 77.5%. But as you can see from this particular graphic, again, the growth rate in that revenue stream has kind of normalized to a normalized growth pattern where we're not seeing that variability like we saw back in FY23. In terms of our consumer-driven revenues, they continue to perform well. General sales tax revenue continues to perform in a robust manner. In FY25, we're estimating an increase of 1.4%. We had really kind of been chasing this revenue in terms of budget to actuals over a number of years, but you see there in FY24, we substantially increased the budget. And now that's why we're seeing more of a moderate in terms of the growth rate in FY25 for general sales tax. I would point out that inflation certainly has an impact on this revenue stream. As the cost of goods goes up, the tax charge for the purchase of those goods also increases. So that's part of what's driving this growth in the general sales tax. Meals tax revenue always seems to perform well. This is one that continues to grow at a high rate for us. I would mention that back in '23, as part of option 2, we did have a half-cent rate increase for the meals tax, so that is part of this revenue stream. And from FY24 to FY25, we are estimating a 14% increase in the revenue generated from the meals tax. So this is the slide I mentioned earlier. This table is showing just the general fund revenue by source, and as you can see on the previous table I showed you that general property taxes were 31.2% of that revenue for the total budget. Here that number has climbed to 56.6%. Our real estate taxes and our personal property taxes certainly make up the lion's share of revenue in the city's general fund. And then if you drop down a couple of lines, you see that state revenue figure has dropped to 13.3%. Again, that's indicative of the fact that so much of that revenue from the state in the total budget is allocated to the school system. When looking back at the schools and looking at their operating fund, you can see the breakdown of revenue that is provided by the city at 44.6% and then the state at 45.2%. There's been kind of a neck and neck competition over the past several years in terms of which source is providing the most funds to the schools. I think last year in the adopted budget, we had moved just ahead in terms of city funding to the schools over the state. But in FY25, based on their proposed budget, the state is contributing just slightly more in terms of the proportion of revenue. So you can see that obviously the revenue sharing agreement there at the top and then state revenue there at the bottom certainly make up the vast majority of revenue to their operating fund. And again, that fund is increasing by 5.6%, very consistent with the overall growth in the city budget. This graphic shows the remaining school funds and the revenue by source. So take away the school operating fund, and this would be those remaining funds. And what you would notice here is that large green slice of pie is the federal government, funding from the federal government. And this is really heavily in their grants fund. Despite that $19 million reduction in federal grants in FY25, they still, in terms of their other funds, receive a substantial amount of federal revenue. So that pie slice would be even bigger if you added that $19 million back in. And then the local sources here is typically things like fee revenue. They have fee revenue in their nutrition or cafeteria fund, as well as in their athletics fund. So that's what that blue slice of pie is showing you is that fee local revenue. Now we'll move over to the CIP. Looking at the 5-year CIP by section, the total 5-year capital program that we are proposing is just over $861 million. The capital budget for FY25 is $367.5 million. The largest section this year is community facilities, and that is driven by the fact that the Public Safety Training Academy is not in the public safety section. It is actually categorized in the community facilities section, so that's what's driving that as the largest section in the 5-year program. And we did something a little different this year on this graphic. What this graphic is showing is just basically that same information broken down on a pie graphic as opposed to a table. But this year, because of the contribution and the significant allocation and dedication that the council is showing to the outcome of safety and security through the Public Safety Training Academy, we wanted to show that project by itself. So you see that there in the red in the upper left-hand quadrant. That's about 17% of the total 5-year program. Switching over to the sources of funding for the CIP, the single largest source in the 5-year program is general obligation bonds. Again, that is being driven by the increase of that funding source to the Public Safety Training Academy. But what I would also point out is, as Chris mentioned earlier, the heavy reliance that we have this year on our one-time funds, our fund balance. Not only the high priority one-time account, but we are also tapping into some other fund balances from some special revenue funds and internal service funds in order to make sure that we are funding our maintenance programs and some of those projects that saw increases in funding due to inflation. Like Chris mentioned, a lot of that bond capacity was moved to the Public Safety Training Academy, so then this cash funding is coming in and backfilling where bonds may typically be the desired funding source for those projects. And this slide just simply shows you that level of funding for FY25 to FY29 is almost $154 million. And again, this is a mix of the high priority one-time account as well as some of those special revenue fund balances. And for my last slide, this is something that we introduced last year. It's an online tool called Open Book. And what we're trying to do is every year to make this tool a little better, provide additional information. So we've done that this year. In addition to revenue and expenditures, which we introduced last year, where citizens or anyone can go in and look online at our online portal and drill down into the budget at a more granular level than even we show in the book. This year we've added personnel, and you can see that up on the screen. I put a box around it. That's something new that we are releasing. And what you will be able to do is go in and look at personnel complements by department, by program. What we hope to do is eventually get as granular as the position or classification level, whereas if you wanted to go in and look at a particular position, police officers, firefighters, solid waste truck drivers, you would be able to look at that level. We're not there yet, but that's something that we hope to add in the not too distant future to this transparency tool. So that's all that I have. I'll stand by for questions, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just a few more slides. So the schedule for work sessions, we'll have 3 work sessions in April to be able to answer any questions council might have, provide some additional information on some items I'm going to show you here in a moment, and then ultimately May 14th for budget consideration. So going back to the chart of things that are funded and unfunded based on items that council specifically asked for those that aren't in my proposed budget, I just want to give you an indication of the path forward so that you know that they're sort of not lost in the ether. The Portsmouth Boulevard name change, we expect that we will continue working as part of the overall redevelopment plan, which with public and private partnerships there. Public defender support, I'll leave till last. I mentioned with Great Bridge Battlefield Museum, we're going to look at a pilot program with tourism funds. Behavioral health docket for General District Court. The courts did not actually ask for that this year, but it's on the radar screen, and we'll continue working with them if that's something that they would like to advance. I already mentioned the George Washington Highway and Moses Grande. And then farm equipment taxes. The Agricultural Advisory Committee had recommended eliminating the farm equipment tax. I believe that we found that the overall impact is pretty small. So, if that's something council wanted to do, we certainly could accomplish that. But tax rate should certainly be something that council's in the driver's seat on. So that's where those all stand. Specifically with regard to the public defender, we had very good conversations with the public defender. They did make a very good case in terms of being able to recruit attorneys throughout the organization. It didn't make my proposed budget because it's inconsistent with council's budget guidance. So this would be supplementing what's otherwise a state function. However, it is not at all uncommon for peer jurisdictions to be providing some level of subsidy from the local government. And so with council's concurrence, we'd like to bring you a work session on this to show you what other cities are doing, where we have some pretty significant disparities between public defenders and other attorneys within that are on either staff or the Commonwealth's attorney, so that if council chooses to make an addition to the budget, we would have time to get it in there and be able to respond. Likewise, if council's interested in the issue related to farm equipment taxes, if you would give me sort of either that concurrence, we could have the ordinances prepared to make that happen. So certainly nothing you have to decide tonight, but I would like, if you're interested in having the conversation on public defender, I would like to schedule that for work session. As always, video of this presentation will be posted tomorrow. People can take a look at the budget on the city's website there. Jonathan mentioned the tool on OpenBook. And then a big thank you on behalf of the team. It's a lot. You can imagine this is a lot of work by budget and all the agencies, but our budget department is second to none, and I really appreciate everything that you all do to get us here. And so with that, it's gone from the city manager's budget to council's budget, and I'll turn it over to council for questions or comments.
And I'll ask any council members who have some brief statements or question marks. This is the first of our work sessions on this topic. So, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Yes, thank you. A couple questions. Number one, regarding the half-cent rededication to the city lockbox, just be frank with us. How robust is that in helping with the debt service reduction for the training center? Because I think was the intent. Is that, and do we have a margin for increasing that?
So the half cent is significant. It was going to be very difficult for us to, it would have literally squeezed out a lot of other projects that we would not have been able to include, some of which are certainly city council priorities. So we felt it was something significant enough to propose a new dedication. And I feel confident that will provide us, assuming real estate assessments continue to grow and the per penny continues to grow, that we've run an analysis out over 20 years, and we certainly feel comfortable with that level. But again, that's based on assumptions that show growth over time.
Right. So I understand this would be something we would consider again if it does need an adjustment one way or the other, next year, the year after, depending upon how significant or how appropriate our revenues are.
Yes, sir. And I would just say, I would hope that we wouldn't have to come back as quickly as next year. If we do, that means we've made a mistake in our analysis. But, you know, maybe 4, 5, 6 years out, we may have to come back and adjust that dedication. So yes, I mean, that's a possibility.
Thank you. The next question, Mr. Manager, is regarding our contributions, our former contributions to the Hampton Roads Regional Jail. Have we necessarily committed all of those funds to the appropriate improvements in the jail, our current jail?
Yes, sir. You actually have agenda items tonight regarding the some of the facility improvements that are necessary, authorization to seek state grant reimbursement for a portion of those facilities. And then even with the addition of the new staff, we anticipate multi-million-dollar expenditure savings year over year, which we've then budgeted to the general fund. So it's not staying with the sheriff, but it's going to the overall general fund. So significant cost savings to the operating budget.
But so council is clear, you've made every effort to provide the sheriff's department with appropriate and meaningful improvements?
Yes, sir.
Good, good. And the last one, maybe you should reiterate again what you mentioned about the city lands that are leased for farming. I don't think many people really are aware of that at all, and its dollar amount.
So, you know, we see a lot of these that come on council agendas, and they're generally pretty quiet, you know, but in totality, it's a very significant investment. We could be using those for other things. There's an opportunity cost of using it for farming. It could be, you know, we could put soccer fields. We could do a lot. We could sell some of the properties. There, some have easements that we can't sell, but to make it available for farming, and it's such a large rate is really, I think, an expression of the city's commitment to farming, and something, if we say we want to be an exceptional place to farm, you know, being able to provide those resources to the farming community. It's I think we have 33,000 acres of active farmland in the city, and for 1,000 of those to be city-owned properties, that is not an insignificant amount.
And that's fairly unique.
Yes, sir.
In Hampton Roads.
Fairly unique statewide, or actually any place that I've ever been.
Great. Thank you.
Anyone else? Ms. Nudes?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Manager, a couple questions. What is a community service aid with the police department, if you know?
So I am not the program person, so if I get this wrong, I'll apologize in advance. However, I believe that these are the individuals that are 18, okay. Very good, okay. So these are the individuals that we typically find, I gotta get the experts up here, you know? I'm certainly not the expert on all this. These are individuals that typically want to be in law enforcement. They're typically 18 to 21, so maybe they haven't hit the age to where they could qualify to be a law enforcement officer. However, it gives them an opportunity to be a part of the police department and do some tasks that we don't require a sworn law enforcement officer to do. And what that actually does is allows our sworn officers to go out and do the things that they can do. So we actually see it as improving response times, because it gets them, the sworn officers, back on the street. And it also has that added benefit of giving those individuals an opportunity to be around the police department and to see if that's something that they would want to pursue as a career.
Thank you. And then as it relates to inflation, I think there was a comment made that inflation is estimated to decrease in the next year. Is that correct, or level out in the next year?
It's increasing, but not at the rate it was increasing. And so I'd just be very candid, we're not at all confident in the fundamentals of the economy. So
Okay.
the rate of inflation that we've had over the past several years is unsustainable. The rate of inflation in real estate is unsustainable. And so we maintain our conservative budget practices so we don't overextend ourselves for when an inevitable downturn does come. But I think what I had mentioned was that the rate of inflation is declining, but inflation year over year is still high and unsustainable.
Okay, so do we look at or calculate, I guess, the cost benefit of expediting projects now with the current rate of inflation versus what it would be in the next year?
Yes, and so that's kind of, our overall budget message, if, on the capital side in particular, is we're doing less projects, but we're going to do those projects more quickly for that very reason.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask a question about the inflation? So the numbers that you're using, but I'm assuming you're projecting year-over-year increases with the big spike already there.
So we aren't projecting anything. Those are actuals that come to us from the Bureau of Economic Analysis.
Those, I believe, are from the Federal Reserve, but that's, so what we showed is the CPI measure.
Want to
Yeah,
come up to the
on up,
mic?
Adrian.
Thank you,
Sorry,
Adrian.
this is our economist.
So what was on the slide is a CPI measure of inflation, less food and energy, but we do have some projection discussion in the revenue section of the operating budget, so I nodded to you because we do use the Congressional Budget Office's projections.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, just to clean that up real quick. Oh, in the slides, we were not showing any projections. In the document, we are, so I apologize if that was confusing.
Okay, so Adrian, what you said is where I was going. The inflation rates, month over month or year over year, do not include energy and/or food.
Correct.
So that we can say whatever we want about how the rate is going, but what folks are feeling in their home budgets are really reflect over and above the CPI.
Yes, ma'am. So the CPI or PCE measures of inflation would probably reflect the same trend, but core versus nominal would be where you see that change. So what we're showing is core, it's less food and energy, and generally with food and energy added, it'll be at a higher rate.
Right, so it's not only individuals, but the city obviously has that additional cost, particularly for energy, as well as the schools, correct?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we are a consumer just like an individual is. So when we go out and consume, we are impacted by the same market forces.
Okay. I think that's also important to highlight that, somehow there's a breakdown often, and I know every household's being pinched, but the city is also experiencing, particularly in energy, a huge cost increase, correct?
Yeah, I believe we have $1 million reserve in Central Fleet for fuel increases. And obviously, you can see the city vehicles, the city fleet on the road every day outperforming services, police department, fire department, development and permits, public works, public utilities. I can go right down the list. Certainly, fuel is something that's very significant to us and our ability to perform programs and services, absolutely.
Ms. Newens?
I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Manager, you mentioned you were willing to do a work session on public defenders and the farm tax if we were, do you need our consensus or request for that?
I intend to do one unless you don't want
Okay.
to have it, but.
No, perfect, thank you.
Any
Mr.
other
Mayor?
questions or comments?
I'll
Ms.
be
Bunn,
very
please.
brief, though. If I can give some more information about the budget request from the Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum. I don't know if it has to be a work session along with the other two items that Ms. Newman was alluding to, but I know that one of the requests, I know there's not going to be enough funding for like the, I guess, a theater or the big conference room, but some funding to help them with personnel to extend their hours of operation would be beneficial, I think. Just
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Manager, and your staff for this budget. It certainly is a daunting task, and we will be spending a lot of time talking about it. Our council meeting will begin, our regular council meeting will begin at 6:30.